In the early 1970s, the world was undergoing a major transformation. The global economy was still recovering from the effects of World War II, and tensions were rising in many parts of the world. One of the most important changes was happening in the world of finance, and it all started with a decision made by the United States government. This decision would shape global economics for decades to come and give birth to a powerful system known as the petrodollar. Before the petrodollar, the world's financial system was based on the Bretton Woods Agreement, established after World War II. Under this system, the US dollar was directly linked to gold. Other countries could exchange their US dollars for gold, which meant the dollar had a solid value. However, in 1971, President Richard Nixon faced a huge problem. The US was spending more money than it had, and its gold reserves were running low. To solve this problem, Nixon made a bold move and ended the direct link between the dollar and gold. This decision, known as the Nixon shock, caused a major shift in the global financial system. The dollar was no longer backed by gold, but instead became a fiat currency, meaning its value was based on trust and confidence rather than a physical commodity. At the time, this was a risky move. Without the backing of gold, many people around the world began to question the value of the US dollar. The US government needed to find a way to restore confidence in the dollar and maintain its position as the world's leading currency. That's when the idea of the petrodollar was born. The US government turned to Saudi Arabia, one of the largest oil producers in the world. In exchange for military protection and economic aid, the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. All oil sales would be priced and sold in US dollars. This meant that countries around the world, whether they were buying oil from Saudi Arabia or from other countries, would have to use US dollars to pay for it. This created an ongoing demand for the US dollar that was unlike anything the world had seen before. The deal between the US and Saudi Arabia was a turning point in the global economy. As the demand for oil increased, so did the demand for dollars. Countries had no choice but to hold large amounts of US dollars in their reserves to pay for oil. This was the foundation of the petrodollar system. Every time a country needed to buy oil, they had to convert their currency into US dollars, which meant that the dollar was in constant demand worldwide. The US government and American banks were in a very powerful position because they could print more dollars without causing inflation. This also meant that the US could run large trade deficits without facing the same financial consequences that other countries would face. For many years, the petrodollar system worked like a charm. As long as oil remained a critical resource for the world, countries continued to need dollars to buy it. The US economy benefited enormously from this system. It allowed the US to import more goods than it exported, leading to a trade deficit. At the same time, the US could borrow money cheaply, as foreign countries continued to hold US dollars in their reserves. American consumers enjoyed low interest rates, and the country experienced a period of economic growth and stability. This arrangement also benefited Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries. In exchange for selling oil in US dollars, they were able to use those dollars to buy American goods, invest in US companies, and strengthen their own economies. This was a win-win situation for both the US and Saudi Arabia. The US got to maintain the dominance of the dollar, while Saudi Arabia received protection and investment from the U.S. as the years passed. The petrodollar system became deeply entrenched in global trade. Other countries around the world, from Japan to Europe to developing nations all had to keep US dollars in their central bank reserves to facilitate trade. The US dollar became the world's primary reserve currency, used for not only oil transactions, but also other international trade and investment. This solidified America's position as the economic superpower of the 20th century. However, this system also had its drawbacks. While the petrodollar allowed the US to maintain economic power, it also made other countries dependent on the US dollar. Any significant changes to the value of the dollar could have ripple effects across the global economy. For example, when the value of the dollar decreased, it made oil more expensive for countries outside of the US. This could cause economic problems, especially for countries that didn't have strong economies of their own. Still, for decades, the petrodollar system worked to America's advantage. It allowed the US to live beyond its means and maintain its position at the top of the global financial hierarchy. The petrodollar was more than just a system for trading. It was a symbol of American power, and it shaped the global financial landscape for nearly 50 years. But as time passed, other nations began to question the petrodollar system and explore alternatives. The dominance of the US dollar, fueled by the petrodollar, would not last forever. Forces were already at work that would eventually challenge the system that had helped fuel America's economic rise. But in the early days of the petrodollar, the world was convinced that this system was unshakable, and for the US, it felt like a free lunch that could never end. The petrodollar system, born in the early 1970s, quickly transformed the global economic landscape, with profound implications for the United States. What started as a simple agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia in exchange for oil being priced in US dollars grew into a strategic advantage that helped America maintain its dominant position in global finance. The benefits to the US were undeniable, and they reached far beyond the oil markets. The petrodollar system became the cornerstone of America's post-war economic prosperity, enabling the country to sustain its growing financial power and its ability to live beyond its means. One of the most significant benefits of the petrodollar system was that it created a constant worldwide demand for the US dollar. Oil, as the world's most traded commodity, was priced and sold exclusively in dollars. This meant that countries around the world, no matter where they were located, had to hold US dollars in their reserves to buy oil. The arrangement led to an ongoing cycle where foreign governments and central banks accumulated dollars. This created a unique situation for the US economy, as other countries were effectively financing America's trade and budget deficits by purchasing US dollars. The US was able to run large trade deficits without the usual consequences, such as inflation or a collapse in the value of its currency. The petrodollar's advantages didn't stop there. As the demand for the dollar grew, the US government and American businesses were able to borrow more money at cheaper rates than they otherwise would have. The dollar became the preferred currency for international trade, not only for oil, but also for many other commodities, goods, and services. The US had the luxury of issuing debt that was easily purchased by foreign countries. This allowed the American government to spend more without having to raise taxes or cut spending. The ability to finance debt cheaply, coupled with a strong demand for US currency, allowed the US to maintain a standard of living that far exceeded what would have been possible under a different financial system for American consumers. The benefits of the petrodollar system were equally apparent. Cheap credit became the norm, allowing individuals to borrow money to purchase homes, cars, and other goods. This fueled a consumer-driven economy where people were able to enjoy higher living standards even as the US continued to run deficits. The petrodollar system gave Americans access to goods and services at affordable prices, as the dollar remained strong on the global stage. This created an economic environment where consumer confidence and spending were at historically high levels. In addition to benefiting from cheap credit, the petrodollar system also contributed to the US's economic dominance in other ways. As the world's primary reserve currency, the US dollar became the standard in global finance. US banks, stock markets, and financial institutions benefited from the increased demand for dollars. American banks were able to offer financial services and credit to governments and corporations around the world. New investment opportunities emerged, many of them centered on US assets. For decades, the US was able to finance its economic ambitions with relatively little pushback, as its currency was deeply embedded in the global economy. The petrodollar system also gave the US political leverage on the international stage. By controlling the flow of dollars in the global economy, the US was able to exert influence over other nations. Countries that wished to buy oil or engage in international trade had no choice but to work within the framework of the US dollar. This gave the US a unique form of economic power, as countries were effectively dependent on the dollar to conduct their business. As a result, the US was able to use its financial clout to impose sanctions, influence trade agreements, and shape international relations in its favor. The dominance of the dollar gave the US government the ability to enforce its will, both economically and politically. Perhaps the most notable advantage of the petrodollar system was the ease with which the US could run trade deficits without facing the same consequences as other nations. Trade deficits occur when a country imports more than it exports, leading to a situation where money flows out of the country. For most nations, running a trade deficit would lead to a weakening currency and higher inflation. But because oil was priced in US dollars, other countries were compelled to keep dollars in their reserves. This created a situation where the US could spend beyond its means without causing the dollar to lose value. The US became a global consumer, importing goods and services from around the world, while paying for them in dollars that other countries needed to hold. This ability to run trade deficits without repercussions allowed the US to fund various military operations, foreign aid programs, and domestic social programs. The US government could spend freely on defense, education, and infrastructure, without worrying about the long-term consequences of increasing its national debt. As the world's largest economy, the US could borrow money cheaply, and because the petrodollar system ensured global demand for dollars, it seemed as though the American economy could never be toppled. The petrodollar also had a hand in the rise of American global corporations. Companies like ExxonMobil, General Electric, and Boeing thrived because the dollar was the currency of choice for international trade. These corporations had access to global markets and could expand their operations worldwide. The petrodollar system created a favorable environment for US businesses to grow and invest, which further strengthened America's economic influence. However, as the years went by, cracks began to appear in this seemingly flawless system. While the US enjoyed the benefits of the petrodollar, other nations were not always happy with their reliance on the dollar. In particular, oil-producing countries outside the US began to question the fairness of the system. The US was benefiting from its ability to print dollars, while countries that sold oil were left holding a currency that wasn't directly tied to their own economies. Over time, some nations began to explore alternatives to the petrodollar, setting the stage for challenges to the system that had once seemed unshakable. But in the 1970s and 1980s, the petrodollar was still seen as an unbeatable advantage. The US was not only benefiting from the oil trade, but also from the dominance of the dollar in every aspect of global finance. The petrodollar system made America the undisputed leader in global economics, creating an economic environment where prosperity seemed endless. But, as the world would later discover, no system lasts forever. Asterisk, asterisk, the petrodollar system, which had worked in favor of the United States for nearly 5 decades, began to show signs of strain as the world entered the 21st century. What once seemed like a solid and unshakable structure was slowly unraveling. For years, the US had enjoyed unparalleled economic advantages, but cracks in the system started to form as the global landscape shifted. These cracks were driven by a combination of factors, including economic imbalances, geopolitical shifts, and the rise of alternative financial systems that posed a challenge to the dollar's dominance. One of the first signs that the petrodollar system was no longer invincible came in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. The crisis revealed deep vulnerabilities in the US financial system, especially regarding the massive debt levels and unsustainable consumer spending that had been made possible, in part, by the petrodollar. For years, the US had been running large budget and trade deficits, confident that the global demand for the dollar would continue to provide the country with economic leverage. But the crisis highlighted that such imbalances were unsustainable in the long run. As the US economy teetered on the brink of collapse, the rest of the world began to take a closer look at its financial position. Countries that had once viewed the US as an economic powerhouse started questioning the long-term stability of the dollar. The fear was that the US was running a massive debt that it could never repay without printing more money, leading to potential inflation and a devaluation of the dollar. While the US was able to print dollars to manage its debt, other countries began to wonder whether this was sustainable in the long term, especially if the dollar was no longer the world's go-to currency. The crisis also caused major shifts in the way countries viewed their own currency reserves. Countries like China, Russia, and Japan, who had accumulated vast amounts of US dollars over the years, began diversifying their holdings. The idea of relying solely on the US dollar for their foreign exchange reserves began to seem risky. As the global economy became more interconnected, nations saw the potential dangers of being overly reliant on a single currency, especially one that was so closely tied to the financial health of the USTHE rise of China as a global economic power played a key role in challenging the petrodollar system. Over the past few decades, China's economy had grown exponentially, and it became the world's largest importer of oil. As China's influence grew, so did its desire to have more control over its own financial destiny. In 2015, China launched the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, INE, which allowed oil transactions to be made in Chinese yuan, rather than US dollars. This was a direct challenge to the petrodollar system, as it offered oil exporting countries an alternative to the US dollar for oil sales. In 2017, China went even further by announcing its intention to launch a gold-backed oil futures contract, known as the yuan-denominated oil futures. This move was a clear signal that China was trying to reduce its reliance on the US dollar and shift towards a more multipolar global financial system. If successful, the yuan-denominated oil futures could provide an alternative currency for oil transactions, especially for countries that were interested in diversifying away from the US dollar. This was a major development, as it marked the first time in decades that another currency had been positioned to compete directly with the US dollar in the global oil market, along with China. Russia had been taking steps to de-dollarize its economy. Over the years, Russia had faced increasing economic sanctions from the US and Europe, which led to a re-evaluation of the role that the dollar played in its economy. Russia, along with other countries like Iran and Venezuela, began exploring ways to conduct oil transactions in currencies other than the US dollar. Russia signed agreements with China to trade oil and other goods in their local currencies, bypassing the dollar in the process. This strategy, known as de-dollarization, gained momentum as more countries, particularly those with strained relations with the US, looked for alternatives to the petrodollar. The rise of cryptocurrencies also played a role in challenging the petrodollar system. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other digital currencies presented a decentralized alternative to traditional financial systems that relied on central banks and national currencies. While cryptocurrencies were still in their infancy, they offered a vision of a financial future that was independent of the US dollar and the institutions that upheld it. In particular, blockchain technology, the underlying technology behind cryptocurrencies, provided a transparent and secure way to conduct transactions without relying on the US dollar or the banking system. As the US dollar began to face competition from these new alternatives, the petrodollar system started to lose its grip on global trade. Oil exporting countries, such as Saudi Arabia, which had long been a loyal partner to the US, began exploring other options. The kingdom, which had been at the center of the petrodollar system, announced in 2018 that it was considering accepting other currencies, such as the euro or Chinese yuan, for oil transactions. While Saudi Arabia's position as a key player in the oil market meant that it would take time for any transition to occur, the mere possibility of the kingdom moving away from the dollar sent shockwaves through the global financial system. The petrodollar system had been built on the premise that oil would always be priced in US dollars. This was a powerful tool for the US, but it also made the US dollar vulnerable to any shifts in the global oil market. As more countries began to embrace alternatives to the US dollar, the system that had once seemed unbreakable started to fray. The US was no longer in complete control of global oil markets, and the dollar's dominance began to fade. By the time the world entered the 2020s, it was clear that the petrodollar was no longer the economic powerhouse it had once been. The rise of alternative currencies, the push for de-dollarization, and the rise of digital currencies had all contributed to the decline of the petrodollar system. America's free lunch, fueled by its ability to print dollars and maintain global dominance, was starting to come to an end. In many ways, the cracks in the petrodollar system represented the changing dynamics of the global economy. While the US had once been able to dominate financial markets through the petrodollar, new players and new technologies were challenging that dominance. The world was becoming a more multipolar place, and the future of global finance no longer seemed so securely tied to the US dollar, asterisk, by the early 2020s. What was once the cornerstone of America's financial dominance, the petrodollar system, had begun to crumble. What had been a reliable foundation for us economic strength for nearly 50 years was now showing signs of irreversible decline. The shift away from the petrodollar had been gradual, yet unmistakable. The death of the petrodollar wasn't one dramatic event, but a series of moves, both planned and unplanned, that collectively marked the end of an era. It was a turning point in global finance, and the United States had to reckon with the consequences. The first major blow came from China. As the world's second-largest economy, China had long been a key player in the global oil market. However, China had grown weary of being dependent on the US dollar for oil transactions. In 2018, China launched a historic initiative to internationalize its own currency. The yuan as a global trade currency. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange, NE, began offering oil futures contracts priced in yuan, a significant challenge to the petrodollar system. This move allowed countries to trade oil in yuan instead of US dollars, signaling that the US dollar might no longer be the exclusive currency for global oil transactions. It was a symbolic move that showcased China's growing influence on the global financial stage and its desire to break free from the dominance of the US dollar. But China didn't stop there. The yuan-backed oil futures contract went even further by adding a key component: gold. By launching the yuan-denominated oil futures contract backed by gold, China sent a powerful message to the world. It was ready to create a new standard in global trade. This development was a direct challenge to the petrodollar's reign, as it offered oil-exporting countries a viable alternative to the US dollar for oil transactions. The yuan, backed by China's vast reserves of gold, represented a shift toward a more multipolar financial system where the dominance of the dollar was no longer a given. The implications of this move were immense, and the financial community took notice. Russia, too, had been preparing for this moment. In the face of economic sanctions from the US and Europe, Russia had started to reduce its reliance on the dollar. Over the years, Russia had taken a proactive stance toward de-dollarization. The Kremlin pushed for agreements with countries like China and India to trade oil and gas in local currencies, bypassing the US dollar altogether. Russia also stockpiled gold, ensuring that it could trade in a more diversified and independent currency system if the need arose. In 2020, Russia announced that it was gradually shifting its oil exports away from the US dollar, opting instead for direct trade in rubles, yuan, or other non-dollar currencies. This was a significant challenge to the petrodollar system, as Russia, a key oil producer, joined a growing list of nations distancing themselves from the US dollar. Meanwhile, the global landscape continued to evolve. In addition to China and Russia, many other countries began taking steps to reduce their dependence on the petrodollar. Countries in the Middle East, traditionally tied to the US due to the petrodollar arrangement, started to explore alternatives. Saudi Arabia, once a staunch ally of the US, began showing interest in diversifying its economy and moving away from the dollar. In 2021, reports emerged that Saudi Arabia was in talks with China to sell oil in yuan instead of dollars, signaling a shift in the kingdom's economic policy. While the move was not yet official, it was enough to send shockwaves through global financial markets. Saudi Arabia's willingness to entertain the idea of using a currency other than the US dollar for oil transactions were seen as a clear sign that the petrodollar system was weakening. At the same time, the rise of digital currencies and blockchain technology added another layer of complexity to the situation. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum gained mainstream acceptance, creating a new form of currency that was not controlled by any central authority, including the US government. These decentralized digital currencies offered an alternative to traditional fiat currencies, including the US dollar. As more countries and businesses adopted cryptocurrencies, the pressure on the petrodollar system grew. The blockchain, the underlying technology of digital currencies, also opened the door to a more transparent and decentralized financial system. This was a direct challenge to the traditional financial institutions that had long supported the dominance of the US dollar. The rise of these alternative financial systems was compounded by the growing dissatisfaction with the US financial system's inherent instability. The US had been running budget and trade deficits for decades, with its national debt reaching unprecedented levels. The US Federal Reserve's ability to print money and maintain global demand for the dollar had allowed the US to get away with fiscal irresponsibility. However, as the petrodollar began to lose its grip, the US found itself facing the consequences of years of mismanagement. Inflation began to rise, and the value of the dollar started to slide as more countries turned to alternative currencies. In 2022, a series of key events marked the formal end of the petrodollar era. The US dollar, which had once been the dominant currency for international trade, started to lose its standing. Countries like Brazil, India, and even European nations began negotiating oil deals in currencies other than the dollar. This further eroded the dollar's dominance in the oil market. By the middle of the decade, the US no longer controlled the terms of global oil trade, and the petrodollar system was officially dead. The end of the petrodollar system marked a profound shift in global power dynamics. The US, which had long benefited from its status as the issuer of the world's primary reserve currency, now had to contend with a world that was no longer reliant on the dollar. The free lunch that America had enjoyed for decades was over. The dollar's decline meant that the US could no longer run up massive trade deficits without facing the consequences. Inflation surged, and the American economy began to experience the fallout of a weakening currency. This moment marked a new chapter in global economics. The world was no longer dependent on a single currency. Instead, a multipolar financial system emerged where several currencies, including the yuan, euro, and digital currencies, began to play a more prominent role in international trade. While this new world order presented new opportunities, it also introduced new challenges for the US, which now had to navigate a more competitive and unpredictable global economic landscape. The death of the petrodollar was a significant event in world history. It marked the end of an era in which the US dollar had been the undisputed leader in global finance. The world had changed, and with it, the economic balance of power. The question now was how the US would adapt to this new reality, one where its currency was no longer the center of the global financial system. The death of the petrodollar system in the early 2020s marked the end of an era for the United States, signaling the close of a chapter in global finance that had spanned over 5 decades. For the US, The petrodollar had been the key to its economic dominance, giving the country unparalleled advantages in trade, debt management, and global influence. Now that the foundation of the petrodollar had crumbled, America faced a new and uncertain future in a rapidly changing global financial landscape. The free lunch that America had enjoyed for decades was over, and the country had to adjust to the consequences for nearly 50 years. The United States had been able to run large trade deficits, accumulate significant debt, and live beyond its means, all thanks to the petrodollar system. As the global demand for oil kept rising, countries around the world were forced to accumulate US dollars to facilitate trade. This constant demand for dollars allowed the US government to borrow money cheaply, maintain interest rates, and fund military operations, social programs, and infrastructure projects without the usual concerns about the long-term effects of such borrowing. The petrodollar system allowed the US to live in a state of fiscal freedom, borrowing and spending with little regard for the future consequences. However, as the petrodollar system began to unravel in the 2020s, the US found itself in a precarious position. The dollar's dominance in global trade was no longer guaranteed, and the economic advantages that had been built on the petrodollar were slipping away. America was no longer in control of global oil markets and its ability to finance. Its ever-growing debt through dollar issuance was being challenged. For the first time in decades, the US had to face the reality that it could no longer rely on the dollar's global status to fund its deficits. The end of the petrodollar system brought several key challenges for the United States. One of the most immediate consequences was inflation. For years, the US had been able to print more dollars without facing the immediate consequences of inflation, as the global demand for dollars kept the currency stable. But with the decline of the petrodollar and the rise of alternative currencies like the yuan and digital currencies, the dollar's value began to slip. Inflation surged as the US found itself unable to rely on the dollar's global status. To keep prices in check, the cost of goods, from oil to consumer products, began to rise, and American consumers felt the effects. The days of cheap goods and interest rates were becoming a thing of the past. As the US dollar weakened, so did America's position in the global economy. The country had long been the world's largest economy, but that was no longer certain. China's rapid economic growth in its efforts to internationalize the yuan posed a direct challenge to the US dollar's role as the global reserve currency. Other countries, particularly in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, were beginning to diversify their foreign exchange reserves away from the US dollar. The shift away from the petrodollar meant that America could no longer expect to enjoy the same level of economic power and influence that it had enjoyed in the past. The end of the petrodollar also meant that the US could no longer rely on its ability to run large trade deficits without facing financial consequences. For decades, the petrodollar system allowed the US to import more goods than it exported, creating a trade deficit that would have been unsustainable for any other nation. The US was able to finance this deficit by issuing dollars and borrowing from foreign nations, but as the demand for the dollar decreased, this became much harder to maintain. The US was now facing the prospect of a shrinking economy. As the global market adjusted to the new reality of a multipolar currency system, the decline of the petrodollar also brought into sharp focus the growing national debt. The US government had long been able to finance its operations through debt issuance, secure in the knowledge that foreign countries would continue to purchase US Treasury bonds in large quantities. However, as the dollar's dominance waned, foreign investors began to pull back from its debt. The US found itself in a position where it could no longer rely on the easy borrowing that had once sustained its economy. The national debt, which had already reached alarming levels, now became a source of concern. Without the petrodollar to cushion the impact, the US faced the very real possibility of financial instability. The transition away from the petrodollar also had significant implications for American foreign policy. For decades, the petrodollar had been a tool of US influence by controlling the global oil market and ensuring that oil was traded in dollars. The US had a powerful lever over other countries. This allowed the US to impose economic sanctions, influence trade agreements, and assert its power on the global stage. However, as more countries began to move away from the dollar, this leverage diminished. Nations that had once been dependent on the US dollar for trade now had more options. This eroded American political influence and marked the beginning of a new geopolitical reality in which the US was no longer the undisputed global power. With the death of the petrodollar, the US had to rethink its economic strategy. The country could no longer rely on the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency to finance its deficits and maintain its position in global markets. The US was forced to confront the long-term consequences of its fiscal policies, and it became clear that adjustments would need to be made. The US government would need to adopt new approaches to managing its economy, reducing its national debt, and addressing the rising costs of inflation. In many ways, the death of the petrodollar marked the end of an era of unchecked American economic power. For decades, the US had been able to maintain its position as the dominant global economic force through the petrodollar system. But as the world evolved and new financial systems emerged, America was forced to adapt. The free lunch that the US had enjoyed for so long had come to an end. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The US could no longer take its position at the top of the global financial pyramid for granted. In the post-petrodollar world, the US would have to navigate a new global economic environment, one where other nations, currencies, and technologies would play a larger role in shaping the future. The death of the petrodollar had marked the beginning of a new era, one where America's financial dominance was no longer guaranteed.